The first light of dawn creeps over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. But there's no time to admire the view. The air is already thick with the sounds of a Roman frontier camp coming to life. The rhythmic clang of hammers on metal, the sharp bark of orders, the low murmur of soldiers swapping stories as they pull on their armor. This is where Rome's might was forged, not just in grand battles, but in the quiet, relentless grind of daily life at the empire's edge. Today, we're stepping into their world, uncovering the hidden rhythms that kept the legions standing strong against the unknown. Think about the sheer scale of what these men faced. Far from home, surrounded by untamed wilderness, they built more than just forts. They built miniature cities, complete with hospitals, workshops, and even bathhouses. Every meal, every patrol, every night spent huddled around a fire was a testament to their ingenuity. How did they turn barren outposts into thriving communities? What secrets did their daily routines hold? The answers lie in the small details, the way they repaired their sandals, the herbs they used to soothe wounds, the games they played to pass the time. These weren't just soldiers, they were survivors, craftsmen, and even farmers, all rolled into one. And here's the thing that might surprise you. Life in a frontier camp wasn't just about endurance. There was camaraderie, even humor, woven into the fabric of their days. Imagine a legionary scribbling a joke on a broken piece of pottery, or sharing a flask of wine with his tent mates after a long march. These moments remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about people. So let's dig deeper beyond the textbooks and the Hollywood gladiators to meet the real men who held the line. By the time we're done, you'll see these frontier camps not as lonely outposts, but as pulsing, living hearts of the empire, places where discipline and creativity collided to keep Rome's dream alive. Ready to uncover their stories, let's begin. Walking through the gates of a Roman frontier camp was like stepping into a slice of Rome itself, transplanted hundreds of miles from the bustling streets of the capital. The grid of neatly aligned streets, the sturdy timber and stone buildings, even the familiar scent of bread baking in communal ovens, every detail was designed to remind its inhabitants of home. But what's truly fascinating is how these camps became more than just military installations. They were living, breathing hubs where Roman culture adapted to the edges of empire. Picture a blacksmith from Gaul hammering out nails next to a Syrian merchant trading spices, while a local craftsman teaches legionaries how to weave reed baskets the way his people have done for generations. This wasn't just a barracks, it was a crossroads of the ancient world. The genius of these camps lay in their balance of rigidity and flexibility. On one hand, they followed the same meticulous blueprint wherever they were built. The commander's headquarters at the center, barracks arranged like clockwork, hospitals positioned for easy access. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was psychological warfare. Any rebel or rival force who stumbled upon a Roman camp would immediately recognize the unshakable order of the empire. Yet dig a little deeper, and you'd find local fingerprints everywhere. The pottery might blend Roman designs with regional patterns. The food would incorporate native grains and spices. Even the gods worshipped in camp shrines often mixed traditional Roman deities with local spirits. Rome knew that to hold a frontier, you had to make it feel like home, not just for the legionaries, but for the people who lived alongside them. And let's not forget the unsung heroes of these camps, the civilians. Soldiers' families, merchants, freedmen, even traveling entertainers all played their part in turning these outposts into communities. A soldier's wife might run a laundry service, His children could attend lessons with a camp scribe, and a retired legionary might open a tavern where off-duty troops traded stories over cups of surprisingly good local beer. This was Rome's secret weapon, the ability to recreate the comforts of civilization in the middle of nowhere. When a legionary patrolled the frontier walls at night, he wasn't just defending an empire, he was protecting a way of life, one that blended the discipline of Rome with the vibrant diversity of the provinces. The frontier camp wasn't just a fortress. It was proof that Rome didn't just conquer territory, it absorbed the world, and in doing so, kept its grip on an empire that stretched from the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Syria. Surviving on the empire's edge demanded more than just discipline. It required an almost artistic mastery of adaptation. Picture a legionary shivering in the dense forests of Germania, where winter winds cut like knives, or squinting under the relentless sun of the Syrian desert, where sand choked the air. These weren't just discomforts, they were existential threats. Yet Rome's soldiers didn't just endure, they innovated. In the north, archaeologists have uncovered barracks with double-layered walls stuffed with straw for insulation, a far cry from the thin tents of Mediterranean campaigns. Meanwhile, in Africa, they dug deep cisterns lined with local clay to trap precious drops of water, turning barren outposts into lifelines. The real brilliance lay in their willingness to learn from the land itself. When standard-issue sandals fell apart in the soggy marshes of Britain, legionaries switched to sturdy native-style boots. When wheat shipments from Italy rotted in the humid Danube frontier, they planted hardy local grains instead. Even their iconic armor wasn't immune to change. Records show some units swapped their heavy lorica segmentata for lighter chainmail in scorching climates. This wasn't just practicality, it was a quiet revolution. By blending Roman engineering with indigenous wisdom, they transformed each camp into a mirror of its surroundings, proving that empire building wasn't about imposing rigidity, but about bending without breaking. And then there's the food, perhaps the most human glimpse into their adaptability. Excavations reveal amphorae stuffed with dates in Judea, barrels of fermented fish sauce in chilly Britannia, even traces of figs and olives in places where those fruits had never grown before. Soldiers didn't just eat what Rome sent, they traded with locals, planted gardens, and experimented with whatever the land offered. A graffito from a fort in Egypt jokes about a legionary's failed attempt to bake bread with unfamiliar grain, while a letter home from a soldier in Gaul begs his mother for the recipe to a local stew he'd grown to love. These weren't just meals, they were lifelines, stitching together the fabric of daily life across 1,000 miles of frontier. What emerges from the artifacts and ruins isn't a story of stubborn Roman superiority, but of quiet collaboration. The same hands that built siege engines could weave reeds into thatch when timber ran short. The men who marched under the eagle standard learned to read snow like Germanic hunters or navigate sandstorms like Bedouin traders. In the end, Rome's greatest strength on the frontier wasn't its swords or walls, it was the humility to adapt, the wisdom to borrow, and the creativity to make any corner of the world feel, against all odds, like home. Keeping thousands of legionaries fed, armed, and ready for battle was a logistical miracle, one that stretched the length of the empire. Imagine a single camp consuming over 2 tons of grain a day, not to mention wine, oil, and salted meat. Every sack of wheat, every replacement spearhead, every nail for repairing fortifications had to travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles over rutted roads, storm-tossed seas, or treacherous mountain passes. This wasn't just about moving supplies, it was about defying geography itself to keep Rome's war machine humming. The backbone of this system was the empire's unmatched infrastructure. Fleets of grain ships traced predictable routes from Egypt's fertile Nile to the Rhine frontier, while ox-drawn wagons creaked along stone-paved highways in convoys dozens long. But what's truly remarkable is how they planned for chaos. Official records from Vindolanda, a fort in northern Britain, reveal meticulous inventories, so many cloaks stockpiled before winter, so many jars of fish sauce rationed to last until the next shipment. And when storms delayed those shipments, that's when the real ingenuity kicked in. Legionaries became hunters, setting traps for wild boar. Quartermasters bartered with local tribes for fresh produce. Some camps even transformed their parade grounds into makeshift farms, planting quick-growing vegetables between training drills. Yet the most fascinating twist lies in how these supply lines became cultural arteries. Amphorae stamped with merchants' names tell us Spanish olive oil reached the Black Sea, while Celtic blacksmiths supplied nails to Germanic forts. A soldier's pay might buy him Egyptian linen or Gallic ham, turning each camp's market into a microcosm of imperial trade. And when official supplies ran thin, soldiers didn't just survive, they thrived, adopting local recipes, brewing beer from whatever grains grew nearby, even improvising tools from scrap metal. This wasn't just logistics, it was the empire's circulatory system, pulsing with goods, ideas, and flavors from every corner of the known world. The true test came during crises. When barbarian raids severed roads or rebellions choked off ports, the legion's adaptability shone brightest. Archaeologists have found evidence of emergency rationing, bread baked with ground acorns during sieges, arrowheads reforged from broken spades. One account describes a besieged camp melting down lead pipes to cast sling bullets. Through it all, Rome's greatest weapon wasn't its gladius or ballistae, but its sheer stubborn refusal to let distance or disaster dictate terms. Every meal served, every patched tent, every mended sandal stood as proof. The empire didn't just move supplies, it moved mountains. A Roman legionary's mess tin might not look like much, just a simple bronze bowl, scorched from countless campfires, but what it carried was the fuel of an empire. Every morning, before the sun crested the horizon, soldiers would gather around communal hearths to receive their daily rations, a thick porridge of ground wheat or barley, simmered in water or goat's milk. This wasn't just breakfast, it was a carefully measured equation of calories and protein, designed to sustain a man through 20-mile marches or hours of combat training. Modern nutritionists would nod in approval. The balance of grains, legumes, and salted meats provided slow-burning energy, while fermented fish sauce, poured liberally over meals, packed a punch of umami flavor and essential minerals. But here's what the official records don't capture: the ingenuity bubbling beneath the surface of those standardized rations. Archaeologists digging through latrine pits and kitchen middens have found surprises. Charred fig seeds in German forts, olive pits in British barracks, even traces of pepper from distant India. These weren't just accidental luxuries, they were proof of a thriving underground economy. Soldiers traded with local farmers, pooled coins to buy spices from passing merchants, or received care packages from home stuffed with hometown delicacies. A letter recovered from Vindolanda begs a friend to send more of his mother's famous fish sauce, while another complains about the camp's dreary bean stew. Even in the rigid hierarchy of the legions, food became a language of comfort and rebellion. The real magic happened after dark, when the official rations gave way to improvisation. Picture a group of off-duty legionaries huddled around a fire, passing a wineskin of posca, that vinegary, herb-infused drink that tasted better after the third sip. Someone pulls out a hare caught in a snare earlier that day. Another contributes wild onions foraged during patrol. The resulting stew, bubbling in a shared cauldron, would never make it into military manuals, but it fed more than just bodies. These were the moments that stitched together disparate men from Gaul, Syria, or Hispania, turning strangers into brothers. A graffiti-scratched joke found on a cooking pot says it all. The cook deserves exile, but the wine deserves a triumph. And then there were the flavors of home, carefully preserved across impossible distances. A handful of dates tucked into a pouch might taste of a Palestinian childhood. A wedge of hard cheese, traded from an alpine herder, could summon memories of misty highlands. Food was the empire's quiet conqueror, more powerful than any sword. When a soldier bit into a loaf of bread baked with imported Egyptian grain, or shared olives cured the way his grandfather taught him, he wasn't just eating. He was remembering why Rome was worth defending. The mess tin was his anchor, the campfire his hearth, and every meal a whispered promise. No matter how far the frontier stretched, home was always a taste away. Step inside a legionary's barracks, and you'd find a world where personal space was measured in inches rather than feet. 8 men, known as a contubernium, shared a single cramped room no larger than a modern parking space, their wooden bunks stacked like shelves along the wall. Each soldier had just enough room to stretch out, his kit stowed beneath the bed, his cloak doubling as a blanket against the chill. Privacy was non-existent. Every cough, snore, or whispered conversation echoed through the thin partitions. Yet within these tight quarters, something remarkable happened. The very lack of space forced bonds deeper than blood. Shared hardship has a way of erasing boundaries. After months of marching together, sleeping shoulder to shoulder, and surviving on the same rations, these men became a family, one forged not by birth but by choice. Artifacts pulled from barrack floors tell the story. A worn die carved from bone, its edges smoothed by countless games of chance. A broken stylus and wax tablet where a soldier practiced writing letters to his mother. Even crude charcoal sketches scratched onto plaster walls, depicting inside jokes or local landmarks. These weren't just idle distractions, they were lifelines, small acts of defiance against the grinding routine of military life. The barracks also became a stage for the subtle theater of rank and reputation. A veteran might claim the driest corner near the hearth, while a fresh recruit endured the drafty spot by the door. Personal quirks became legendary. The snorer everyone learned to tolerate, the neat freak who meticulously polished his gear each night, the storyteller who could spin tales of home so vivid you could almost smell the olive groves. Rivalries flared over borrowed equipment or disputed dice rolls, but so did acts of quiet generosity, sharing extra rations with a sick tent mate, stitching up a torn tunic by firelight, or teaching a younger soldier how to mend his sandals. What's striking is how these relationships transcended language and culture. A contubernium might include a Greek-speaking medic from Antioch, a Celtic auxiliary from Gaul, and a grizzled Italian centurion, yet they developed their own shorthand, their own rituals, even their own hybrid slang. Letters recovered from places like Vindolanda reveal the emotional weight of these bonds. One soldier writes of celebrating Saturnalia by exchanging gifts with his squad. Another jokes about losing a month's pay to his bunkmate in a dice game, while a third pens a heartfelt plea for news of his unit after being transferred. The barracks weren't just where they slept. They were the birthplace of loyalty that could outlast empires. And then there were the nights when exhaustion gave way to unexpected warmth. Picture a freezing winter evening on the German frontier, the barracks braziers glowing faintly as men huddled under shared blankets. Someone hums a tune from his village. Another passes around a flask of cheap wine. Laughter bubbles up over a clumsy retelling of Jupiter's latest misadventures, the story growing wilder with each retelling. In these moments, the rigid hierarchy of the legion softened. The centurion's orders faded, replaced by the easy rhythm of shared humanity. That's the untold secret of Rome's frontier camps. Their real strength didn't come from walls or weapons, but from the unbreakable web of connections woven in the dark, one whispered story, one shared meal, one roll of the dice at a time. A spear thrust gone wrong during training, a festering wound from a rusty nail, a fever that spreads like wildfire through the barracks. On Rome's frontiers, danger wasn't just lurking beyond the walls. It was in every cut, every cough, every sip of contaminated water. Yet what's astonishing isn't how many legionaries fell to injury or illness, but how many survived thanks to a medical system centuries ahead of its time. The Roman army didn't just patch up its soldiers, it engineered a healthcare network so sophisticated, some of its principles still resonate in modern military medicine. Take the humble field hospital, or valetudinarium as the Romans called it. These weren't just tents with bandages, they were purpose-built facilities with separate wards for infectious diseases, surgical suites with drainage systems, even recovery rooms positioned to maximize sunlight. Archaeologists working at the legionary fortress of Novaesium in Germania uncovered a hospital complex large enough to treat hundreds, complete with a pharmacy stocked with herbs from across the empire. Imagine a wounded soldier from Britannia being treated with Egyptian honey for his wounds, or a feverish recruit from Hispania sipping a tea brewed from Balkan willow bark, nature's answer to aspirin. This was medicine without borders, blending Greek theories, Egyptian remedies, and local folk wisdom into something greater than the sum of its parts. The real heroes were the medici, the army's doctors, trained in Alexandria's famed medical schools or apprenticed to veteran surgeons. They wielded tools that would look familiar to a modern medic. Bronze scalpels with replaceable blades, precise bone drills for trepanation, even specialized hooks for extracting arrowheads. A surgical kit found near Hadrian's Wall contained instruments so finely crafted, they could still make clean incisions when tested by researchers 2,000 years later. But their brilliance lay in knowing when not to cut. Herbal poultices of garlic and thyme fought infection, while boiled wine served as an antiseptic rinse. They set broken bones with linen splints soaked in resin to harden like plaster casts, and prescribed rest, a radical concept in an era when many believed illness was caused by angry gods. Yet perhaps their most revolutionary insight was understanding that health began outside the hospital. Latrines were built downstream from water sources, with running channels to flush waste away. Bathhouses weren't luxuries, they were mandatory hygiene stations where soldiers scrubbed off the grime of travel, reducing the risk of parasites and skin infections. Even the army's infamous vinegar ration played a role when mixed with water. It killed harmful bacteria, making it safer to drink from questionable wells. The legions didn't just fight enemies, they waged war on filth, and in doing so, achieved feats of survival that bordered on the miraculous. The proof is in the bones. Skeletal remains from frontier cemeteries tell a story of resilience, healed fractures, signs of successful amputations, even evidence of dental work where cavities were filled with gold. One particularly poignant grave in Austria holds a legionary who lived for years after a spearhead lodged in his spine, likely thanks to a cane found buried beside him. These weren't just statistics, they were men given second chances by a system that valued their lives as much as their swords. And then there were the invisible battles against plagues that could decimate whole cohorts, or the grinding toll of dysentery on long marches. Here, the Romans displayed a chillingly modern grasp of quarantine. Sick troops were isolated, contaminated clothing burned, and camps relocated if the ground itself was deemed unhealthy. A first-century medical manual from a fort in Dasha details precautions for dealing with pestilential air, recommending smoke from aromatic woods to purify rooms. It wasn't perfect, they didn't understand germs, only their effects, but their empirical approach saved countless lives. What emerges from the records and ruins is a portrait of medicine as both science and art. A surgeon might recite Hippocrates while stitching a wound with thread made from a soldier's own hair, or prescribe a poultice of crushed snails and honey because some frontline medic swore by it. The Army's medical corps was a living, evolving entity as adaptable as the legions themselves. When a recruit stepped into the dim light of a field hospital, he wasn't just entering a building. He was touching the edge of an empire's compassion, a silent promise that Rome would fight for his life as fiercely as it asked him to fight for hers. The gods walked with Rome's legions not just in the grand temples of the capital, but in the humble shrines tucked between barracks and stables along the frontier. Step into any camp and you'd find a spiritual tapestry as diverse as the empire itself. A statue of Mars, god of war, his polished helmet reflecting firelight, standing shoulder to shoulder with a crudely carved local river spirit offered by a recruit from some distant valley. This wasn't just piety, it was practicality. When your life depended on the next harvest, the next battle, or simply surviving another winter, you left no deity unappeased. Archaeologists have peeled back layers of dirt to reveal this spiritual patchwork. At Carnuntum on the Danube, a shrine to Mithras, the soldier's favorite mystery cult, lies buried beneath a Christian chapel, a silent testament to shifting beliefs. In Britain, cursed tablets made of lead whisper furious pleas to Celtic goddesses for vengeance against thieves who stole cloaks or swindled dice games. Even the most routine objects carried divine weight. Amulets shaped like phalluses warded off evil, while belt buckles bore inscriptions invoking Fortuna for protection. The message was clear: faith wasn't confined to temples. It was woven into every strap of armor, every meal shared, every anxious glance toward the tree line at dusk. But religion here was more than superstition. It was rhythm. The rigid military calendar pulsed with festivals, Saturnalia's role reversals where grunts played officers for a day, the raucous Parilia celebrations marking Rome's founding, complete with bonfires and mock battles. These weren't just breaks from duty, they were pressure valves, moments when the strict hierarchy softened. A centurion might pour wine for his men at a feast honoring Jupiter, sharing stories of past campaigns as equals before the gods. The same soldiers who'd stand stone-faced in formation could weep openly during rites for fallen comrades, their grief sanctified by collective ritual. And then there were the personal devotions, the quiet bargains struck in the dark. A recruit from Gaul might leave a handful of wildflowers at a makeshift altar to Epona, the horse goddess of his homeland. A Syrian archer could whisper prayers to the sunset in his native tongue, fingers brushing a tiny bronze statue of Baal tucked beneath his tunic. Rome tolerated, even encouraged these private acts, so long as the public rituals to state gods were observed. The empire understood that a soldier who felt spiritually anchored was a soldier who fought harder, marched farther, and remained loyal when the pay was late. The genius of this system lay in its flexibility. When legions marched into Germania, they didn't just bring Roman gods, they identified local deities with their own, creating hybrid protectors. A Germanic forest spirit became Silvanus, a Celtic healer merged with Apollo. This spiritual diplomacy turned potential conflicts into connections, helping soldiers see the divine not just in Rome's pantheon, but in the very land they garrisoned. A votive tablet found near Hadrian's Wall captures it perfectly, a crude drawing of a Roman officer and a British tribesman offering together to a god labeled both Mars and Cassidius. their prayers mingling in the same smoke. Yet for all its communal power, faith also offered solitary refuge. Imagine a sentry on the night watch, clutching an amulet from his mother as he stared into the blackness beyond the torchlight. Or a wounded veteran pressing a coin into the hand of a camp priest, begging for a dream of home. These intimate moments remind us that the legions weren't just machines of conquest, they were collections of hearts and hopes, each beating to the rhythm of different gods, yet united by the unshakable belief that something greater walked beside them on the frontier's edge. The crack of a centurion's vine staff against a shield echoed through the camp, sharp as a whip, a sound every legionary knew meant trouble. Discipline in the Roman legions wasn't just about punishment, it was a language, one that spoke of order in a world where chaos lurked beyond every frontier. Picture a young recruit caught sleeping on watch, dragged before his unit at dawn to face not just his centurion's wrath, but the collective judgment of 80 men who'd now share his punishment. This was Rome's genius, making discipline communal, where one man's failure became everyone's burden. The message was clear: your actions could save your brothers or doom them. But the system was more nuanced than Hollywood's blood-soaked depictions. While serious crimes like desertion or striking an officer did carry the ultimate penalty, most infractions were met with calculated humiliation rather than brutality. A soldier who neglected his armor might be forced to stand guard barefoot in nothing but his tunic, his shame visible to all. A drunkard could find himself digging latrines for a month, his hangover worsened by the jeers of his comrades. Even the infamous decimation, where every 10th man in a mutinous unit was clubbed to death by his fellows, was vanishingly rare, reserved for catastrophic failures of loyalty. What kept most men in line wasn't fear of execution, but dread of losing the respect of the only family they had left. The real surprise lies in the parchment records that survived the centuries. A payroll tablet from Vindolanda shows deductions for lost equipment, not floggings, proving the army often preferred fines over lashings. Letters between officers reveal debates over whether to pardon a first-time offender or make an example of him. One particularly touching account describes a commander reducing a soldier's punishment after receiving a petition signed by his entire contubernium, pledging to oversee his reform. This wasn't just mercy, it was psychology. A legion that punished without purpose bred resentment, but one that balanced justice with second chances forged unbreakable bonds. Discipline also had its rituals, carefully staged to maximize their lesson. Before a punishment detail marched out to repair roads or dredge ditches, they'd be paraded before the entire camp stripped of their military belts, the very symbol of their status as soldiers. A single day without that prized piece of leather was enough to motivate most men to toe the line. Yet the same system that shamed also rewarded. A century that excelled in drills might earn extra wine rations or the right to wear decorative fallery on their armor. The message was unmistakable. Excellence belonged to the group just as failure did. Perhaps most fascinating is how these rules adapted to local realities. On the scorching Syrian frontier, water discipline was sacrosanct. Stealing from another's canteen could mean being buried up to your neck in the desert sun. In rainy Britannia, punishments often involved standing guard in exposed positions without cloaks, the chill seeping into bones as effectively as any lash. The army even had a peculiar form of probation for repeat offenders, assigning them to mess tent policing, where they'd serve meals and scrub pots under the mocking gaze of their peers, a social pressure cooker more effective than any dungeon. What emerges from the records is a system that understood human nature. Soldiers weren't mindless automatons. They were men who responded to pride, shame, and the desperate need to belong. When a veteran legionary took a raw recruit aside to show him how to properly edge his sword, it wasn't just skill being passed down, it was the unspoken code. The true discipline of the legions lived in those quiet moments far from the centurion's gaze, in the way men policed each other's behavior, covered for small mistakes, and only reported what truly threatened the unit. They weren't just following orders, they were upholding a pact, one that said no man would be left behind, and no man would drag the others down. The vine staff might enforce the rules, but it was loyalty that made them stick. Dawn on the frontier didn't bring a moment's respite, it brought the thunder of hobnailed boots stamping in unison across packed earth. Training wasn't just part of legionary life, it was life, a relentless cycle that turned raw recruits into extensions of their weapons. Picture a teenager from Hispania, his hands still soft from farm work, now blistered from hours of drilling with a wooden practice sword twice as heavy as the real thing. Beside him, a grizzled veteran from Illyria barks corrections, demonstrating the exact angle to hold a shield so it deflects arrows instead of guiding them into your face. This was education written in sweat and calluses, where failure wasn't graded with scrolls but with survival. The genius of Rome's training lay in its brutal simplicity. Every movement was broken into steps so precise they could be performed blindfolded. Marching drills weren't just about endurance. They taught men to shift from column to battle line mid-stride, a maneuver that could mean the difference between order and chaos when ambushed in a mountain pass. Weapons practice happened rain or shine, with recruits repeating thrusts until their arms trembled, because muscle memory had to outlast fear. Archaeologists have found practice posts at frontier forts grooved by thousands of strikes, their surfaces worn smooth like the pages of a well-read manual. These weren't just training tools, they were silent witnesses to the unglamorous labor behind Rome's military machine. But mock battles were where theory met reality. Imagine a field outside the camp transformed into a staged war zone, veterans playing the role of barbarian hordes who fought dirty, ambushing from trees, feigning retreats to lure pursuers into traps. Newcomers learned the hard way that real enemies didn't follow parade ground rules. A recovered diary from a recruit in Mosia describes his humiliation during one such exercise, tricked into charging uphill, only to be slaughtered by hidden comrades pelting him with cloth-wrapped rocks. The lesson: victory went to the adaptable, not just the strong. What's often overlooked is how these drills doubled as psychological conditioning. When a century practiced forming a testudo under a hail of practice sling stones, they weren't just mastering a formation, they were learning to trust the man beside them to hold his shield steady. The infamous marching camp drills, where legions built and dismantled full fortifications in a single day, taught more than engineering. They instilled the certainty that no terrain was unconquerable. Even the ritual of polishing armor to a mirror shine had purpose. A soldier who took pride in his gear would defend it fiercely in battle. The true secret, though, lay in the unspoken curriculum. Veterans didn't just teach how to fight, they passed down the folklore of survival, how to spot poisoned water sources by the absence of bird tracks, which local herbs could numb a wound when the medici were overwhelmed, the trick of rubbing garlic on spearheads to cause festering wounds. This was knowledge earned through generations of trial and error, shared over campfires like heirlooms. A writing tablet from Germania records one such lesson, a centurion's warning about frostbite, complete with sketches of how to wrap feet in dried grass for insulation. And then there were the tests no manual could prepare you for. A sudden night alarm when the watch horns blew, sending half-dressed men scrambling to their positions. A surprise inspection where every piece of kit had to be produced instantly, missing a spoon, meant a day digging latrines. These weren't arbitrary torments. They forged the reflexes that kept legions alive when real disaster struck. History remembers the battles, but it was these endless hours of repetition that made the difference when a shield wall held against impossible odds, or when a century wheeled to face an unseen threat without a single shouted order. The frontier camp's true legacy wasn't their walls or weapons. It was the invisible discipline etched into thousands of minds and muscles. When archaeologists uncover practiced javelins weighted with lead to build strength, or find footprints fossilized in mud where recruits once drilled, they're touching the heartbeat of Rome's empire. Not the glamour of conquest, but the quiet, unyielding determination to be ready, always ready for whatever the wild edges of the world could throw at them. The faint glow of signal fires flickered along Hadrian's wall, each flare a heartbeat in the vast nervous system of Rome's empire. Communication wasn't just about orders, it was the lifeline that turned scattered frontier camps into a single, breathing organism. Imagine a dispatch rider galloping through a moonless night, his saddlebags stuffed with wax tablets. One might hold the governor's decree about grain shipments, while another carried a soldier's scrawled plea to his mother for wool socks before winter. This was the duality of Rome's messaging, majestic and mundane, imperial and intimate, all racing across the same roads. Latin might have been the official tongue, but the frontier buzzed with a linguistic kaleidoscope. A centurion from Italia could be overheard barking drill commands in Latin one moment, then haggling over horse prices in fractured Celtic the next. Letters recovered from forts like Vindolanda reveal scribes switching languages mid-sentence, their ink smudged from haste. A Greek medic's note about a patient's fever might end with a Celtic phrase for "get well soon," learned from local healers. This wasn't just practical, it was survival. When a Germanic scout brought word of tribal movements, the officer who understood his dialect without a translator gained precious hours to prepare. The real marvel was the infrastructure humming behind every message. Signal towers spaced a Roman mile apart, about 4,800 feet, formed chains that could relay coded fire signals from the Rhine to Rome in under a day. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of these towers in the Syrian desert, their staircases worn smooth by generations of watchmen who scanned horizons for prearranged patterns of smoke or torchlight. One fragmentary military manual describes an ingenious system. 3 columns of smoke meant cavalry approaching, 5 indicated a supply convoy under attack. But when secrecy was paramount, they switched to carrier pigeons, a trick borrowed from Egyptian traders, with birds trained to fly between fixed lofts at staggering speeds. Yet the most poignant discoveries aren't in the grand strategies, but in the personal fragments. A child's practice alphabet scratched onto a shard of pottery. A love letter from a soldier's wife in Pompeii, her words still fragrant with pressed flowers after 2 millennia. Even complaints carry echoes across time. One tablet from Britannia grumbles about the local beer, while another from a Syrian archer asks his brother to send decent olive oil because what passes for it here would disgrace a barbarian's kitchen. These weren't just correspondences, they were lifelines against loneliness, proof that no matter how far the legions marched, they carried home in their words. And then there were the unsung heroes, the scribes who straddled 2 worlds. Picture a military clerk in a Gaulish outpost, his hands ink-stained as he painstakingly translated a tribal elder's plea for grain into formal Latin for the governor's eyes. Or a Germanic auxiliary drafted to write warnings about river floods in his native runes for nearby villages. Literacy became currency. Soldiers who could read earned extra wine rations, while those who mastered shorthand found themselves whisked from ditch digging to record keeping. The army's bureaucracy was so voracious, it even birthed a peculiar dialect, military Latin. peppered with loanwords and abbreviations that would make a senator blush. The frontier's true secret: communication wasn't just about control, it was about connection. When a soldier in Egypt received a letter from his brother stationed in Britannia, both men knew their words had traveled farther than most civilians ever would. That scroll in his hands wasn't just parchment, it was a thread stitching together an empire vast as the known world. Every message, whether etched in wax or whispered between scouts, carried the same unspoken promise: you are not forgotten. You are still Rome. The dice clattered across the barrack floor, landing with a decisive thud. Snake eyes. Groans erupted from the circle of legionaries gathered around, their faces illuminated by flickering lamplight as coins changed hands for the 100th time that night. Gambling wasn't just a pastime in Rome's frontier camps, it was an obsession. Soldiers wagered on everything from dice games to chariot races, heard secondhand from distant cities, even betting on how many raindrops would slide down a tent pole before sunrise. A recovered writing tablet from Germania records a soldier's furious complaint about losing a month's pay to a bunkmate's cursed lucky throw. But these games served a deeper purpose. In a world where the next battle could be your last, the rush of chance made the unbearable grind feel alive. Yet dice were just the beginning. Step into any off-duty barracks, and you'd find men hunched over latrunculi boards, Rome's answer to chess, their strategies as intricate as battlefield tactics. Excavations at frontier forts have turned up handmade game pieces carved from bone or repurposed pebbles, some worn smooth from years of play. The rules were simple: capture your opponents, soldiers, by outmaneuvering them, a mirror of the discipline that governed their real lives. Even here, competition thrived, with veterans boasting of unbeaten streaks stretching back to their first postings. But when the games grew stale, storytelling took over. Picture a grizzled veteran holding court by the fire, his voice dipping low as he recounted the siege of Jerusalem or his near-death encounter with a Germanic berserker. These weren't just tales, they were oral history passed down like heirlooms. Younger recruits listened wide-eyed, absorbing lessons no training manual could teach: how frostbite feels when it sets in, the eerie silence before an ambush, the way a dying enemy might whisper his mother's name. Storytelling was survival disguised as entertainment, wrapping hard truths in the comfort of shared experience. For grander spectacles, frontier camps often boasted their own amphitheaters, not the marble colosseums of Rome, but rough-hewn arenas where soldiers doubled as gladiators. These weren't fights to the death, but carefully choreographed displays of skill, complete with wooden swords and blunted spears. A soldier from Gaul might don makeshift armor to play a barbarian chieftain, while his Spanish comrade played the heroic legionary, their mock battles drawing roaring crowds. Athletic contests were equally fierce, wrestling matches where men grappled in sand pits, foot races along the ramparts, even improvised javelin throws using tent poles. The prizes: extra wine rations, a week's reprieve from latrine duty, were trivial compared to the real reward: the sheer, uncomplicated joy of being celebrated for something other than killing. Music, too, wove through camp life. A Syrian recruit's flute might trill a homesick melody from Antioch, while African drummers pounded rhythms that set the entire century tapping their feet. Archaeologists have found remnants of lyres and panpipes in barracks, some lovingly repaired with leather straps or makeshift glue. Singing was communal, whether bawdy marching songs or haunting hymns to distant gods. A scrap of papyrus from Egypt preserves the lyrics of a drinking chant, its ink blurred by what might have been spilled beer or tears. And then there were the quietest escapes. A soldier sketching his village on a wax tablet, another carving a tiny figurine of his daughter from scrap wood. These solitary acts weren't just hobbies, they were lifelines to identities beyond the legion. A trove found near Hadrian's Wall included a set of wooden letters from a soldier to his sweetheart, each painstakingly smoothed to avoid splinters, a tactile reminder that tenderness survived even here at the empire's edge. Leisure wasn't a luxury, it was the glue that held men together through endless winters and scorching summers, through the terror of the unknown and the monotony of the routine. Every roll of the dice, every shared story, every sweaty victory in the makeshift arena whispered the same truth: you are more than your sword. You are a man who laughs, who dreams, who remembers. And that, more than any wall or watchtower, was what kept Rome's frontiers standing. Beyond the fortress walls, the real work of empire unfolded in the smoky interiors of tribal longhouses, the bustling markets that sprang up near camp gates, and the quiet marriages that wove soldiers into the fabric of frontier life. A legionary's world wasn't confined to his barracks. It stretched into the villages where he traded salt for furs, the farms where he courted local girls, and the chieftain's hall where uneasy alliances were sealed with handshakes and hostage exchanges. This was Rome's frontier paradox. The same soldiers who enforced imperial rule with their swords became neighbors, trading partners, and even family to the people they were sent to control. Take the simple act of bartering. Excavations around camps like Vindolanda reveal layers of discarded goods: Roman glass beads mixed with Celtic brooches, Samian ware pottery stacked beside handmade local urns. Soldiers didn't just impose their tastes, they adapted them. A Germanic tribesman might walk away with a fine Italian wine jug, while a legionary proudly wore a bearskin cloak stitched in a pattern unique to some distant valley. These exchanges weren't just economic, they were cultural dialogues. A cookpot found near the Danube shows scorch marks where someone tried to prepare Roman-style fish sauce over an open hearth, blending culinary traditions into something entirely new. But the most intimate negotiations happened far from market stalls. Tombstones along the Rhine tell silent stories of unions between legionaries and local women. A Thracian soldier buried beside his Frisian wife, their children bearing names that mashed Latin and Germanic roots into something uniquely frontier. These marriages were Rome's secret stabilizers. A soldier with in-laws among the local tribes had skin in the game, quite literally, his loyalties now stretched beyond the legion. Letters from Egypt reveal touching details: a Syrian auxiliary sending half his pay to his Egyptian wife's family, a Gaulish veteran pleading with his commander for land near his British widow's village. The empire didn't just tolerate these bonds, it relied on them to soften the edges of occupation. Yet blending worlds wasn't always peaceful. Rebellions could erupt when cultural friction overheated, like the Batavian Revolt, where soldiers who'd married into local tribes found themselves torn between oath and kinship. A fragmentary dispatch from Germania reports a chilling ultimatum given to auxiliaries: prove your loyalty by executing rebel captives who might be your cousins. The frontier was a hall of mirrors where a trader one day could become a spy the next, and a chieftain's daughter might whisper warnings to her Roman husband moments before an ambush. The genius of Rome's approach lay in its flexibility. When tensions flared, commanders might host grand feasts for local leaders, plying them with wine and promises. Archaeologists have found entire banqueting sets buried near fort gates, likely gifts for diplomatic entertaining. Other times, they played the long game, letting veterans settle on granted lands as living advertisements for Roman life. A retired centurion's farmhouse in Gaul might boast Roman-style hypocaust heating while its walls were painted with local pagan motifs, a compromise etched in plaster and tile. What emerges from the ruins isn't a story of conquerors and conquered, but of constant, messy negotiation. The frontier was a place where a Celtic priestess could heal Roman children with herbs, where a Pannonian blacksmith taught legionaries to forge weapons the way his ancestors had, where Latin love poems were scrawled in the margins of letters written in Aramaic. Every shared meal, every mixed marriage, every traded secret added another thread to the fabric of a world that was neither fully Roman nor wholly native, but something altogether new. The true measure of Rome's power wasn't just in the battles it won, but in the lives it irrevocably tangled together along its ever-shifting edges. The laughter of children echoed through the fortress streets, mingling with the clatter of armor, a sound that would surprise many who picture Roman camps as strictly male domains. Archaeological evidence shatters this stereotype. Tiny leather shoes preserved in mud, delicate hairpins found beneath barrack floors, even the remains of wooden dolls with movable limbs. These weren't accidental losses. They were proof that women and children weren't just visitors, they were part of the frontier's fabric. From high-ranking officers' wives hosting dinners in the Principia to unofficial camp wives who formed bonds with soldiers far from home, female presence transformed stark military outposts into living communities. Consider the sheer logistics of their lives. A commander's wife might oversee a household staff of slaves and servants, ensuring her husband entertained visiting dignitaries with proper Roman decorum, even if the fine wine was locally brewed and the imported olives came from a valley 2 days' march away. Meanwhile, the widow of a retired legionary could run a tavern by the camp gates, her children playing among the supply carts while she negotiated with Syrian wine merchants. The Vindelander tablets preserve a particularly touching snapshot, a birthday invitation from one officer's wife to another, complete with complaints about the British weather ruining her best silk stola. These weren't just domestic details, they were acts of cultural defiance, proof that Roman eaters could flourish even at the empire's edge. But the real story lies in the shadows of official records. Many women who shared soldiers' lives left no legal trace. Unofficial unions between legionaries and local women were common, though technically forbidden until the reign of Septimius Severus. A tombstone near the Danube tells a silent tale. It depicts a cavalryman holding hands with a woman in native dress, their names lost to time. Nearby, archaeologists found the skeleton of a young woman buried with both a Roman-style brooch and a Celtic torque around her neck, a life caught between two worlds. These relationships often began pragmatically, a soldier needing someone to mend his clothes, a local woman seeking protection, but letters revealed deeper bonds. One soldier's scrawl on a wax tablet begs his commander for leave to visit his heart's joy in a nearby village, promising to return before watch duty. Children of the frontier grew up speaking a linguistic patchwork: Latin from their fathers, local dialects from their mothers, and the crude slang of the barracks from playing near training grounds. Some became cultural bridges. A bilingual child might help a Gaulish merchant negotiate with quartermasters or explain Roman customs to curious tribesmen. The army tacitly encouraged this, letting soldiers' sons train as camp followers who carried water during drills or learned basic first aid from medics. A few even rose through the ranks. The Emperor Pertinax began as the son of a freedman working in a legionary supply depot. The domestic rhythms of these families softened the frontier's harshness. Laundry drying on makeshift lines between barracks, the smell of stew bubbling in communal kitchens, even the inevitable squabbles over noise or shared latrines. All these mundane moments made the unbearable bearable. A soldier returning from patrol might be greeted by his daughter waving a makeshift flag, or find his wife bargaining with a Dacian trader for fresh eggs. These weren't distractions from military life, they were its emotional ballast. When a plague swept through a Mosian fort in the 2nd century, it wasn't just the death toll that haunted survivors, it was the small shoes lined up outside empty tents, the unfinished knitting left beside cold hearths. What emerges isn't just a correction to the men-only myth, but a richer understanding of how Rome held its borders. The women who darned socks by lamplight, the children who played centurion with sticks for swords, the elderly midwives who delivered babies in both Roman and native traditions. They were the unseen glue of empire. A fortress might be built with stone and timber, but it was sustained by something far more fragile and powerful: the human need for connection, for home, for a future worth guarding through the long, lonely watches of the night. The wind howling across the Danube carried more than just winter's bite. It carried the weight of 1,000 silent griefs. For every sword sharpened on the frontier, there was a heart dulled by distance, a mind frayed by years of staring at horizons that never brought the sights they longed for. A soldier's true enemy wasn't always the barbarian beyond the palisade. Sometimes it was the crushing isolation that seeped into his bones during the long watches of the night. The artifacts they left behind tell this story in whispers. A wax tablet smudged with tears where a man from Hispania penned his daughter's name over and over. A tombstone in Britannia carved with the image of a Gaulish mother's face, etched from memory by hands that would never touch her again. Yet Rome understood something revolutionary for its time. A legionary's strength wasn't just measured in muscle or swordplay, but in his ability to endure the relentless erosion of loneliness. That's why commanders staged raucous Saturnalia feasts where officers served their men, or why entire cohorts would erupt into spontaneous races across the drill field, not just for sport, but to manufacture joy where nature left only emptiness. The clatter of dice in the barracks wasn't merely gambling. It was therapy, a way to simulate the chaotic noise of the Roman streets these men missed so desperately. Even the army's notorious bureaucracy played its part. Soldiers could request transfers to be nearer to brothers or childhood friends, proving that the empire knew nostalgia could be as deadly as any spear. The most poignant survival tactic, though, was the flood of letters that pulsed along Rome's roads like a life support system. At Vindolanda, archaeologists found a birthday invitation from one officer's wife to another, complete with gossip about local scandals, a mundane scrap that became sacred simply because it was normal. Soldiers traded letters like currency. A man who received news from home might read it aloud to his contubernium, letting 8 souls briefly bask in the warmth of his family's words. Some went further, commissioning scribes to carve entire letters onto thin sheets of lead, then folding them into tiny scrolls to be worn as amulets against despair. One such note found near Cologne simply reads, "Tell Lucius his father remembers the olive tree they planted, it thrives. Graves tell an even starker tale." While official monuments boasted of battles won, private tombstones often whispered of different battles, those fought against the ache of separation. A cavalryman buried in Syria lies beneath a stone engraved with his hometown skyline, rendered from memory. Another in Germania is depicted not in armor, but in the simple tunic he'd have worn tending vineyards in Campania. These weren't just memorials, they were protests against the frontier's power to erase who these men had been before it claimed them. But perhaps the most heartbreaking finds are the ghost letters, messages begun and never sent, their wax-smoothed blank by anxious fingers over time. A writing tablet from Mosia shows where a soldier started writing to his aging mother, only to abandon the attempt after 3 lines. Maybe he feared news of his illness would worry her. Maybe he'd forgotten the words for his love, or maybe, as the camp psychiatrist would recognize today, speaking of home made the distance hurt more. Rome's real genius lay in its grudging acceptance that no amount of discipline could conquer human emotion. When a legion in Dacia was found staging nightly reenactments of neighborhood plays from Rome, complete with men donning wigs to impersonate female roles, commanders turned a blind eye. When Germanic auxiliaries were caught howling tribal laments into the midnight air, no centurion intervened. The army that demanded uniformity in battle allowed this quiet rebellion of memory because it understood something timeless. The heart fights its own wars, and no fortress wall can keep out longing. The true measure of Rome's endurance wasn't just in the battles it won, but in the unspoken pact that no soldier, no matter how far flung, would be left to face his loneliness alone. A legionary's shovel bit into the earth with the same decisive force as his sword, because Rome knew conquest wasn't just about taking land, but transforming it. Across the empire's edges, soldiers doubled as engineers, turning muddy tracks into arrow-straight highways, raging rivers into arched stone bridges, and barren hillsides into webs of aqueducts that defied gravity. These weren't just infrastructure projects, they were psychological masterstrokes. When a local tribesman saw a river that had thwarted his ancestors for generations suddenly tamed by Roman archers, or watched clear water gush from a hillside pipe where only dry rock had been before, he wasn't just witnessing engineering, he was seeing magic made real. The true brilliance lay in the legion's ability to build fast and forever. Marching camps might be temporary, but their roads were designed to outlast empires. Excavations along the Danube reveal highways layered like lasagna, gravel foundations, crushed stone binders, and surfaces cambered so precisely that puddles still don't form after 2,000 winters. Soldiers carried standardized measuring rods marked with the imperial eagle, ensuring every mile looked identical whether in Syria or Spain. A bridge near modern-day Trier shows their precision. Its piers were angled slightly upstream to deflect floodwaters, a trick learned from disastrous collapses elsewhere. This wasn't just construction, it was institutional memory made tangible, each project building on hard-won lessons scribbled in some long-lost engineer's manual. But the aqueducts were where Roman engineering verged on arrogance. At Caesarea in Judea, legionaries pieced together a channel that snaked through mountains and floated across valleys on towering arches, delivering fresh water to a city literally carved from desert. The mathematics behind these feats still staggers gradients calculated to drop precisely 1 foot every 1,000 feet, ensuring flow without erosion. And when local materials fell short, they improvised. In Britain's peat-rich fens, engineers laid wooden pipelines sealed with wool grease, while North African legions lined channels with waterproof cement made from volcanic ash shipped from Italy. Every solution whispered the same message: no terrain was unconquerable, no obstacle insurmountable. What's often overlooked is how these projects served as covert training grounds. A recruit sweating to quarry stone for a bridge wasn't just laboring, he was learning to read rock strata, judge weight distribution, and lead work teams. By the time he swung a pickaxe in battle to undermine enemy walls, he'd already done it 100 times in peace, the famed Corvus boarding ramps used in naval battles. They were perfected by engineers who'd spent years designing fortress drawbridges. Even the iconic testudo formation found echoes in construction, where teams moved like living cranes, passing heavy stones along human chains with the same synchronized precision they'd later used to pass shields. The psychological impact was equally calculated. Roads didn't just connect points A and B, they etched Rome's order onto chaotic landscapes. Straight as a spear cast by Jupiter, these highways ignored natural contours, slicing through sacred groves and ancestral burial mounds with deliberate disregard. Local guides who'd earned their keep leading travelers through labyrinthine passes suddenly found themselves obsolete. A milestone near Antioch says it all: to Rome, 720 miles. Not to the next town over, but straight to the heart of empire, a tangible reminder that every path now led back to the eternal city. Yet for all their might, these structures also reveal quiet acts of compromise. In Gaul, engineers incorporated Celtic spiral motifs into bridge railings. Assyrian aqueducts' control valves bear inscriptions in both Latin and Aramaic. Even the roads, those arrogant slashes across the land, eventually curved to avoid a particularly revered oak or spring when resistance grew too fierce. The message was subtle but clear. Rome could bend without breaking, could conquer without erasing. Today, when you walk a Welsh sheep trail that still follows a legion's roadbed, or fill your water bottle from a Spanish fountain first tapped by Roman pipes, you're touching the empire's true legacy, not just the ruins it left behind, but the unshakable idea that civilization could flourish anywhere, even at the world's edge. The laughter in the barracks could turn to murmurs, and murmurs to roars in the blink of an eye, because even Rome's iron discipline had its breaking point. A legionary might endure frozen winters, blistering marches, and the ever-present specter of battle, but delay his pay for months, or pile on one too many backbreaking labor details, and the unthinkable could happen: mutiny. These weren't just tantrums, they were calculated rebellions that exposed the razor-thin line between order and chaos on the frontier. Take the infamous revolt of the Pannonian legions in the year 14. After years of grueling campaigns and empty pay chests, 3 entire legions erupted in open rebellion. Soldiers tore down their standards, the sacred eagles that symbolized their honor, and turned their camps into fortified strongholds against their own commanders. What began as grumbling over back pay spiraled into something darker: veterans demanding discharge, recruits refusing orders, even centurions being flogged by their own men. The historian Tacitus paints a chilling scene of veteran soldiers weeping as they burned their own barracks, not out of malice but sheer desperation. This wasn't just about coins, it was about betrayal. A soldier's pay wasn't just currency, it was the empire's promise that his sacrifices mattered. Break that promise, and you shattered the very foundation of loyalty. Yet mutinies also revealed the legion's paradoxical nature. The same men who could overthrow their officers one day might defend Rome to the death the next if handled correctly. When the future Emperor Tiberius's son, Drusus, arrived to quell the Pannonian revolt, he didn't come with executioners. He listened, he negotiated, he even shed theatrical tears over the soldiers' grievances, playing on their sense of shame. And it worked. No mass executions, no decimations, just concessions on pay and service terms, delivered with enough pomp to let the legion save face. Compare that to the Rhine Mutiny the same year, where the commander Germanicus resorted to desperate measures, forging letters from the emperor, even faking a suicide attempt to guilt his troops into submission. Both approaches restored order, but only one preserved trust. The true danger lay in commanders who mistook discipline for deafness. In Britannia, the governor Astorius Scapula once ordered a legion to march through a swamp as punishment for complaining about rations. Dozens drowned, and the survivors carried that rage straight into their next battle, where their half-hearted fighting nearly cost Rome the province. Contrast that with Agricola, who decades later kept his troops loyal during a brutal Scottish campaign by personally sharing their hardships, even eating the same meager rations. The lesson was clear: legionaries would swallow hardship if they believed their leaders were swallowing it too. Archaeology offers haunting glimpses of these fractures. At a fort in Germania, excavators found a stash of coins hidden beneath a barrack floor, likely a soldier's secret savings, distrustful of his own paymasters. Another site revealed a mass grave of executed soldiers, their skeletons still bearing the marks of fatal blows from Roman gladii. But perhaps most poignant are the graffiti scrawled on walls, crude cartoons mocking greedy officers, or lines of poetry lamenting broken promises. These weren't the words of faceless rebels, they were the voices of men pushed too far. What's often overlooked is how mutinies could birth unexpected reforms. After the Pannonian Revolt, Augustus standardized military pay across the empire. Following a rebellion in Egypt over grain shortages, Rome overhauled its supply chains. Even the infamous Year of the Four Emperors crisis, sparked by mutinous legions, forced the Flavians to grant soldiers citizenship and land bonuses. The empire learned, however slowly, that its swords had minds and hearts attached, and those hearts needed tending as carefully as their blades. The frontier's fragile peace wasn't held by fear alone, but by an unspoken covenant. So long as Rome upheld its end fair pay, bearable conditions, respect for the sacrifices made, the legions would hold the line against the world. But let that covenant crack, and the very hands that built the empire's roads could tear them apart. Mutinies were Rome's recurring nightmare, a reminder that no wall was high enough to keep out the consequences of broken trust. The crack of a Batavian war horn splitting the dawn air wasn't just a signal, it was a paradox. The man blowing that horn wore Roman armor, followed Roman orders, and would die for Roman pay, yet his ancestors had once fought desperately to keep the legions out of his homeland. Auxiliaries like him weren't just supporting actors in Rome's frontier story, they were its beating heart, a masterstroke of imperial pragmatism that turned conquered warriors into empire builders. While citizen legions garrisoned secure provinces, it was these non-citizen regiments recruited from Gaul, Thrace, Syria, and beyond who patrolled the wildest edges of Rome's domain, often standing guard within sight of their own villages. Consider the sheer scale of this system. By the 2nd century, auxiliaries outnumbered legionaries nearly 2-to-1, forming specialized units that played to their homeland's strengths. Syrian archers could loose arrows with terrifying accuracy from horseback, Batavian cavalry swam rivers in full armor to surprise enemies, and Dalmatian light infantry scaled cliffs like mountain goats. Rome didn't just tolerate these differences, it weaponized them. A military diploma found in Britain spells out the bargain. After 25 years of service, an auxiliary received not just Roman citizenship, but the right to pass it to his children. That bronze document was more valuable than any sword. It transformed a barbarian's grandson into a senator's equal, but loyalty wasn't bought with promises alone. Pay records from Vindolanda reveal auxiliaries earned roughly a third less than legionaries, yet they also show bonuses for re-enlistment and secret stipends for units stationed in their homelands. A Batavian serving on the Rhine might receive extra coin to visit family during leave, while a Numidian horseman in North Africa got allowances for maintaining traditional gear. These weren't bribes, they were psychological threads tethering men to the empire through the very cultures Rome had supposedly erased. The real genius emerged in Crisis. When Boudicca's rebellion torched Britannia, it was Tungrian auxiliaries who held a narrow defile against thousands, buying time for legions to regroup. Their commander, a Romanized Briton who knew the terrain like his childhood hunting grounds. Similarly, when Trajan marched into Dacia, his Syrian archers provided cover while Mosian auxiliaries' men who'd grown up navigating those same Carpathian passes guided supply trains through hidden trails. Local knowledge didn't just supplement Roman might, it made the impossible achievable. Yet this system carried explosive risks. Tombstones tell silent stories of divided loyalties, like that of a Thracian auxiliary buried near the Danube, his epitaph proudly listing his Roman honors, while the carving shows him holding a traditional rhomphair curved sword. Even the infamous Varus disaster in Germania traces back to auxiliary betrayal. Arminius, a Cheruscan raised in Rome, used his insider knowledge to lead 3 legions into a massacre. The empire learned hard lessons. Auxiliary units were always stationed far from their recruitment zones, and officers meticulously mixed ethnicities to prevent unified rebellions. Archaeology reveals the cultural alchemy this created. A cavalry barracks in Hungary yielded a trove of Roman-style dice alongside Germanic bone amulets. A Syrian archer's grave in Britain contained a tiny statuette of Jupiter wearing a local sun god's rays. These men weren't just serving Rome, they were remixing it, blending traditions in ways that would outlast the empire itself. When a retired auxiliary in Gaul built his villa with Roman mosaics depicting Celtic harvest festivals, he wasn't being contradictory, he was embodying the frontier's truest victory, making Rome mean something malleable enough to hold 1,000 different dreams. The ultimate testament lies in what came after. As the Western Empire crumbled, many of the barbarian leaders carving out kingdoms were descendants of auxiliaries, men whose grandfathers had earned citizenship defending the very borders their grandsons now crossed. The auxiliary system didn't just sustain Rome's frontiers, it planted the seeds of the world that would replace it, proving that empires aren't just conquered or defended, but slowly absorbed into the bloodstream of those they once ruled. The bronze discharge diploma felt heavier than any sword after 25 winters of marching, bleeding, and building. It was finally in his hands. For the first time in a lifetime, no horn would wake him at dawn, no centurion would bark orders, and the only land he'd need to defend was his own. Retirement for a Roman veteran wasn't just an end to service. It was a second act, one where the empire repaid loyalty with the ultimate gift, a chance to put down roots. These weren't just individual rewards, they were calculated acts of empire building. Veterans were settled in strategic colonies, often near their old postings, transforming frontier camps into permanent towns. Picture a grizzled legionary from the Rhine legions hacking through dense forest to clear farmland, his sword now repurposed as a scythe. Nearby, his former comrade, once a master builder of siege engines, supervised the construction of a stone villa with military precision, its foundations laid out in perfect alignment like a miniature camp. These settlements weren't accidents, they were Rome's insurance policy. A retired soldier with a vested interest in the land was far more likely to grab his old shield if rebels threatened his vineyard. But the transition wasn't always smooth. Pay records from Egypt reveal bitter disputes over promised land grants. Some veterans waited years while bureaucrats shuffled scrolls. A poignant letter from Mosia begs the emperor for intervention. I served with honor at Trajan's bridge, yet my plot floods each spring. Others struggled to adapt. Tombstone epitaphs sometimes list a man's military rank decades after discharge, as if civilian life never quite erased the soldier beneath. Yet for those who thrived, retirement became a cultural alchemy. In North Africa, retired legionaries introduced olive presses to Berber communities, their groves eventually supplying Rome's insatiable demand for oil. Along the Danube, veteran colonies became trading hubs where Roman pottery and local amber changed hands. Even language transformed. Linguists trace Romanians' Latin roots to these outposts, where retired soldiers' Latin blended with Dacian dialects into something entirely new. The most fascinating evidence comes from the small details. A child's toy sword found in a veteran's home in Gaul mimics the gladius exactly, right down to the unit markings. A kitchen in Britain yielded cooking pots with charred residues of both Roman fish sauce and native herb stews. These weren't just homes, they were laboratories where military discipline and local traditions fused into a hybrid way of life. Rome understood that a veteran with a thriving farm, a family, and a stake in the system was the empire's best advertisement. When a Germanic chieftain saw his former enemy, now a neighbor, harvesting wheat from fields that once grew only barley, the message was clear: Rome didn't just take, it transformed. And for the old soldier watching his grandchildren play beneath the same oak where he'd once stood guard, retirement wasn't just an end. It was proof that the long march had been worth it, not just for the empire but for himself. A legionary's tunic, rough, spun from wool and dyed the color of rust, was more than just clothing. It was a second skin, worn thin by endless marches and patched with the pride of a soldier who refused to let the frontier wear him down. Every stitch in that fabric told a story. The frayed hem from scraping against Dacian brambles, the mismatched repair over the left shoulder where a Germanic spear had grazed too close, even the faint smell of wood smoke from 1,000 campfires. This wasn't just a uniform, it was a living record of survival. Yet for all its simplicity, that tunic was part of a meticulously engineered system. Under the scorching sun of Syria, a soldier might soak it in water to stay cool, while in the damp chill of Britannia, he'd layer it beneath a sagum cloak oiled to repel rain. Excavations at Vindolanda revealed a trove of textile fragments, some patched with leather, others reinforced with extra stitching at stress points. The message was clear: Rome standardized the cut, but legionaries customized the details. One particularly poignant find was a tunic sleeve with names embroidered in neat, if clumsy, letters likely the work of a comrade commemorating fallen friends before sending the garment home to grieving families. Then there was the armor, that iconic shell of steel and sweat. The lorica segmentata with its overlapping iron plates wasn't just protection, it was a masterpiece of modular design. A damaged shoulder plate could be swapped in minutes without dismantling the whole harness, a lifesaver on campaigns far from workshops. But look closer and you'd spot the personal touches. A Celtic auxiliary's brass fittings polished to mimic his tribe's talks, a Syrian archer's engraved invocation to the sun god Bel, even a grizzled centurion's cheek guards etched with the battles he'd survived. These weren't decorations, they were declarations of identity in a machine that prized uniformity. Footwear revealed even more ingenuity. The calagi, those sturdy sandals studded with hobnails, were engineered to grip mud, disperse weight, and crucially dry fast after river crossings. But the real genius lay in their adaptability. In the freezing north, soldiers lined them with wool or stuffed them with grass like the locals did. In the scorching east, some cut ventilation holes between the straps. A cache found near Hadrian's Wall included one sole with a crude carving of a phallus, the Roman equivalent of a lucky rabbit's foot, right where the owner's heel would rest with every step. Belts might seem mundane, but to a legionary, that strip of leather was his resume. The apron of dangling straps wasn't just decorative, each carried the weight of his tools and weapons, their arrangement subtly signaling rank and experience. A veteran's belt might jangle with the souvenirs of a dozen postings, a replacement buckle from a Gallic smith, a knife sheath stitched with Egyptian thread, even charms from local religions he'd encountered. Meanwhile, a recruit's pristine belt marked him as dangerously green, a target for both teasing and extra drills from watchful centurions. Perhaps the most intimate item was the pinula, that heavy cloak doubling as blanket, tent, and shroud. Woven from coarse wool but often lined with stolen silk or patches of native fur, it was the soldier's mobile sanctuary. A diary fragment from Germania describes a man bartering his extra rations for marten pelts to line his, while a will found in Egypt bequeaths a cloak stained with Nile mud and mended by Marcus's mother to a fellow soldier. These were more than possessions, they were tactile connections to worlds beyond the frontier's edge. The true testament to this gear's legacy isn't in museums, it's in the way modern reenactors still swear by its practicality after weeks of field testing, or how a child can instantly recognize a legionary's silhouette 2 millennia later. That blend of ruthless efficiency and deeply human customization captures Rome's frontier paradox. an empire that demanded conformity, yet somehow made room for individuality in the stitching between the steel plates. Winter transformed Rome's frontier camps from bustling hubs of conquest into frozen islands of waiting. The same fields that echoed with summer drills lay buried under drifts of snow, while rivers that served as highways for supply boats became impassable sheets of ice. Campaign seasons ground to a halt not because Rome feared battle, but because even the empire's unmatched logistics couldn't overcome nature's veto. For the legions, winter wasn't just a season. It was a siege against boredom, cold, and the creeping dread that spring might bring worse. Cramped winter quarters became pressure cookers of human ingenuity. Barracks designed for 8 men now squeezed in 12 as units consolidated for warmth, their breath frosting the air in shared clouds. Archaeological evidence from Germania reveals ingenious adaptations: double-thatched roofs stuffed with moss for insulation, floors lined with heated stones from the bathhouse, even makeshift partitions woven from reeds to carve out slivers of privacy. Soldiers spent hours repairing gear, but this wasn't mindless busywork. A cracked lorica segmentata plate required precise riveting to maintain flexibility, while restringing a composite bow in dry indoor air prevented the sinew from weakening. These tasks passed time but also honed skills. Every stitch in a torn cloak was practice for suturing wounds, every sharpened sword edge a meditation on the fights to come. Survival hinged on stockpiles gathered during autumn's frenzy. At the fortress of Carnuntum on the Danube, granaries held enough spelt and barley to feed thousands for months, while underground cellars preserved apples in honey and salted meat in clay jars. But the real lifelines were the unexpected treasures traded from local tribes: smoked fish from Baltic villages, barrels of fermented cabbage that staved off scurvy, even jars of pine resin mixed with beeswax to rub on feet against frostbite. A writing tablet from Britannia records a centurion's frustration when his men traded their entire wine ration for a single barrel of Celtic heather ale, a deal he begrudgingly admitted was repugnant yet sensible, given the local brew's higher alcohol content. Camaraderie became the unsung weapon against winter's psychological toll. The same contubernium that fought as one in battle now schemed together to beat the monotony. Dice games evolved into week-long tournaments with elaborate handicaps for veterans. Storytelling turned competitive, with soldiers voting on the most outlandish tales. A surviving graffito in Mosia boasts, "I once drank a Thracian under the table and stole his horse." Even gossip became currency, with news from distant corners of the empire dissected for hidden meaning. A letter from Vindolanda hints at this desperate creativity, describing how a group of legionaries staged a mock naval battle in their barracks using bread loaves as ships and mice as sea monsters. Yet winter also exposed the frontier's fragile balance. When blizzards blocked supply routes, rations shrank to thin gruel flavored with last summer's garum. Frostbite could fell more men than enemy spears. Medical texts from the era describe blackened toes being amputated with the same cold precision as trimming leather straps. And beneath the forced cheer lurked darker currents. A dispatch from the Rhine recounts a near mutiny when a gambling debt spiraled into a brawl that left 2 men dead, not by blades, but from head wounds inflicted with a frozen sausage one had hidden as a weapon. The true test came in those endless nights when the wind howled like vengeful spirits. Men who faced barbarian charges without flinching found themselves unnerved by the creak of ice-laden branches or the distant howls of wolves. Some turned to religion, offering votives to winter deities like the Celtic Cernunnos or the Germanic Frau Hall. Others sought solace in letters home, their words growing more plaintive as the cold deepened. One such note found near the Danube simply reads, "Tell mother not to worry. The cold is sharp, but we are sharper. When spring finally cracked the ice on the rivers, the legions emerged changed. The same men who entered winter as individual soldiers now moved with the synchronicity of a machine, their bonds tempered by shared hardship. They marched out not just rested but reinvented, provisional experts in survival, their kits modified by months of tinkering, their patience honed to a razor's edge. Winter hadn't weakened Rome's grip on the frontier. It had forged that grip into something far stronger. Not just the strength of steel, but the resilience of men who'd learned to outlast even the seasons themselves. A cavalryman's first loyalty wasn't to his centurion or even to the emperor. It was to the four-legged partner standing beside him in the pre-dawn chill, breath steaming in sync with his own. Horses weren't just transport in Rome's frontier camps. They were battle brothers, their hooves pounding the same rhythms as their riders' hearts during charges. The bond between legionary and steed ran deeper than discipline. Archaeologists have found graves where war horses were buried with full honors, their skeletons still bearing the telltale grooves of well-worn bits, their teeth worn from years of accepting apples from armored hands. One particularly poignant discovery in Pannonia revealed a mare interred with her cavalryman, her skull resting against his shoulder as if in final embrace. These animals weren't equipment, they were comrades whose instincts often saved human lives. A cavalry manual from the era describes how seasoned mounts would react to hidden ambushes before their riders noticed danger, their ears flicking toward suspicious rustles in the underbrush. But the true unsung heroes of the frontier were the mules, sturdy, stubborn, and indispensable. While poets sang of glorious stallions, it was these shaggy-eared workhorses who moved mountains of grain over alpine passes and hauled siege engines through Balkan mud. Their value was calculated down to the denarius. Military ledgers from Vindolanda record payments to muleteers higher than some junior officers' wages. The genius of Roman logistics lay in understanding these animals' limits. They standardized pack saddles to distribute weight evenly, developed hoof ointments from pine tar and beeswax, and even designed special snowshoes for winter treks. A humorous graffito from a Gaulish fort shows a crude sketch of a mule labeled "The Real Conqueror of Britannia," a nod to the countless tons of supplies they dragged across hostile terrain. Then there were the dogs, not pampered pets, but working partners who shared both the dangers and rhythms of camp life. Molossian hounds, massive as modern mastiffs, patrolled the ramparts with leather-studded collars, their deep barrows echoing through the night. Smaller curs specialized in vermin control, keeping granaries safe from rats that could devour a month's rations in days. But the archaeological record reveals something unexpected. Many of these dogs were buried with care, some even wearing makeshift jewelry. A tombstone near the Danube depicts a hound named Margarita, Pearl, curled at her master's feet, the inscription thanking her for 7 years of steadfast watch. Forensic analysis of dog bones from frontier sites shows healed fractures, proof that injured animals were nursed back to health rather than discarded. The interdependence between legionaries and animals reshaped the frontier itself. Cavalry remount stations doubled as breeding centers, introducing North African stallions to Germanic mares and creating tougher hybrids. Pack mules carried not just supplies but genetic diversity. Their descendants still pull carts in alpine villages today. Even the dogs left a legacy. DNA studies trace modern European Guard breeds back to Roman army stock. This wasn't just coexistence, it was coevolution, with humans and animals adapting to each other's needs under the empire's demanding conditions. What emerges isn't the sterile hierarchy of master and beast, but a web of mutual reliance. A soldier might share his last crust of bread with his mule during a siege, knowing the animal's strength meant the difference between survival and starvation. A sentry dog's warning growl could mean an extra heartbeat to grab a shield before the attack came. And when a cavalryman stroked his horse's neck before battle, whispering promises of extra oats if they both lived through the day, it wasn't just sentiment, it was the unspoken pact that bound all Rome's creatures together on the wild edges of the world. The rustle of leaves in a Germanic forest might signal a deer, or a Roman scout with his face smeared in mud, his hair matted to mimic local warriors, his Latin accent buried under months of practicing guttural tribal dialects. Intelligence gathering on Rome's frontiers wasn't just about intercepted messages. It was an art of becoming invisible, of learning to move through enemy lands not as conquerors but as shadows. While the legion's gleaming armor projected imperial might, their survival often hinged on the silent work of spies who traded swords for subtler weapons, observation, disguise, and the patience to listen at tribal campfires until dawn. Consider the explorators, specialized scout units recruited from border regions precisely because they knew the terrain and tongues. A Batavian auxiliary could slip across the Rhine disguised as a trader, his wagon hiding not goods, but mental maps of river crossings and tribal alliances. In the east, Syrian horsemen with desert-bred endurance tracked Parthian caravans for days, counting men and weapons beneath their cloaks. These weren't lone operatives, they were nodes in a sophisticated network. A wax tablet from Britannia records a scout's report down to the number of cooking fires in a Caledonian village, suggesting troop strength based on how many pots were boiling meat versus porridge. Deception reached its zenith with false flag operations. During Trajan's Dacian wars, Danubian legionaries grew their hair long, adopted local tattoos, and infiltrated mountain strongholds as deserters seeking refuge. Their mission: identify which chieftains could be bribed and which bridges were weakest. One account describes a soldier who lived as a blacksmith's apprentice for months, memorizing the comings and goings of warriors until his forged iron arrowheads deliberately brittle snapped mid-battle, sabotaging an entire attack. Yet Rome's greatest intelligence coup wasn't cloak and dagger theatrics but bureaucratic brilliance. Every intercepted letter, every trader's gossip about crop failures, every defector's tale was cross-referenced in the Commentarii, vast ledgers maintained at frontier headquarters. A fragment from Carnuntum shows officers analyzing a pattern. Germanic raids always spiked after poor harvests. The solution: secret grain shipments to buffer shortages, undercutting rebel recruitment. This wasn't just espionage, it was predictive governance, using information to stabilize rather than slaughter. The frontier's true masters were the diplomat spies, men like the Frumentarii who moved undercover as grain inspectors. A surviving report from Syria details how one agent posed as a wine merchant to befriend a Parthian commander's steward, learning of planned invasions through drunken boasts. Another in Gaul gifted tribal leaders with Roman-style feastware, embedded with lead strips that tainted their wine, making them too ill to lead revolts. These weren't just tricks, they were psychological operations centuries ahead of their time. What's startling is how fluid loyalties could be. A Germanic warrior turned Roman informant might demand citizenship for his children as payment. A captured scout spared from execution often became a double agent, feeding false trails back to his people. The Vindelander tablets even record a Britannic chieftain's daughter who traded tribal secrets for the safety of her Romanized brother. The frontier wasn't a line between friend and foe, but a murky spectrum of shifting allegiances where today's spy might be tomorrow's senator. Archaeology reveals the tools of this shadow war. A hollow signet ring found near the Danube could conceal poison or coded messages. A trader's scale from Germania had weighted plates that hid tiny maps beneath them. Even children's toys weren't above suspicion. Dice excavated in Britain were loaded, likely used to cheat information out of drunken sentries during friendly games. The ultimate testament to Rome's intelligence prowess lies in what didn't happen. No barbarian coalition ever matched Hannibal's surprise Alpine crossing. No rebellion caught the legions utterly unprepared. When tribes did mass against the empire, it was usually after years of Roman agents sowing discord to keep them divided. The real victory wasn't just in knowing where the enemy was, but in ensuring they never knew where Rome was weakest. The frontier's safety wasn't just won with walls and watchtowers, but in the unmarked graves of those who'd lived and died by their wits rather than their blades. A lone tombstone stands sentinel on a windswept hillside near Hadrian's Wall, its Latin inscription worn smooth by centuries of rain, but the grief carved into its surface remains sharp as the day a heartbroken comrade set it there. Death on Rome's frontier was as much a part of military life as drill practice or fort construction. Yet the way soldiers honored their fallen reveals a poignant collision of imperial uniformity and deeply personal sorrow. These graves weren't just holes in the ground, they were final musters where rank, origin, and belief systems jostled for space beneath the same foreign soil. Consider the stark contrast between burials. A common legionary might be laid to rest with little more than his identification tags, two small lead tablets strung around his neck bearing his name and unit, tucked into a simple wood-lined grave. Yet just paces away, a centurion's tomb could rise like a miniature temple, adorned with carvings of his battle exploits and an epitaph boasting of his 25 years of unbroken loyalty. The real surprise, many of these grand monuments weren't commissioned by the army, but by the deceased's brothers in arms. A first-century stele from Germania records how an entire century pooled their wages to memorialize their commander, the inscription bluntly stating, "He never sent us into danger without leading the charge himself." The artifacts buried with these men whisper secrets about their lives and hopes. A soldier's grave in Syria contained a carefully folded parade uniform beside a worn pair of native-made sandals, a silent testament to dual identities. Another in Britain held a dice set where one die was deliberately fixed to always land on 6, perhaps ensuring luck in the afterlife. Most haunting are the ghost meals found in Mosion tombs, plates holding petrified crumbs of bread and fish, vessels still smelling of wine dregs after 2 millennia. These weren't mere rituals, they were acts of love, sending the departed off with the same rations they'd shared around campfires. Women and children appear in these necropolises too, their memorials often blending Roman and local traditions. The tombstone of a cavalryman's British wife shows her in native dress but with a Roman hairstyle, her epitaph proudly noting she kept both households, the military quarters and the family's ancestral home. Infant graves frequently include tiny amulets of Epona, the Celtic horse goddess reinterpreted as a protector of souls. Even pets received recognition. A poignant mosaic from a veteran's tomb in Gaul depicts his war dog lying faithfully at his feet, the inscription, "Never again to bark at strangers," capturing more grief than any epic poem. What's rarely discussed is how burial practices adapted to frontier realities. In the arid sands of Egypt, soldiers were interred in shallow graves with their faces covered by painted shrouds, a hybrid of Roman protocol and local preservation techniques. Along the Danube, the dead were often placed in boats or with miniature oars, reflecting both legionary naval service and Slavic beliefs about river crossings to the afterlife. Even the tombstones themselves became cultural palimpsests. A marker in Judea bears a menorah beside Mars' spear, while another in Numidia mixes Latin epitaphs with Berber tribal symbols. The true power of these sites lies in their unguarded humanity. A tombstone near Cologne shows a veteran's hand clasping his wife's, their carved fingers interlaced for eternity. Another in Dalmatia bears a crude sketch of a fishing boat, not a military trophy, but a nod to the peacetime life its owner dreamed of reclaiming. These stones remind us that for all its discipline, Rome's army was made of men who laughed, loved, and left behind more than just battle records. They left proof that even on the empire's farthest edges, where the wind howled through lonely outposts and the stars shone unfamiliar, soldiers still clung to the hope that their names and the sacrifices behind them would not be forgotten. The grid of a Roman frontier camp didn't vanish when the last legionary marched away. It became a ghostly blueprint for the towns that grew in its shadow. Walk through modern Trier in Germany or York in England, and beneath the pavement, you'll find the unmistakable imprint of those original military roads, still running straight as a pilum's shaft after 2,000 years. These weren't just abandoned outposts, they were seeds of civilization, where the empire's retreat left behind something far more enduring than conquest. The forum of a legionary fortress might become a medieval marketplace, its basilica repurposed as a church, while the sturdy stone walls that once held back barbarians now cradle cafes and bookshops. Rome's genius lay in building not just for war, but for the centuries to come. Yet not all camps thrived. Along lonely stretches of the Danube or deep in North African deserts, crumbling watchtowers stand as stark reminders of empire's limits. These places didn't fade quietly, they were swallowed by the very landscapes they'd tried to tame. Brambles now curl through the barracks of a Numidian fort, and swallows nest in the broken arches of a Dacian bathhouse. But even in ruin, their influence lingers. Local shepherds still use Roman roads as droveways, their flocks treading paths worn smooth by hobnailed boots. The dry stone walls of abandoned granaries have been scavenged for farmsteads, their stones bearing the chisel marks of long-dead engineers. These silent ruins taught later generations lessons about water channels, fortification angles, and the stubborn art of making stone outlast flesh. The real legacy, though, isn't in brick or mortar. It's in the habits of survival forged on those frontiers. When Germanic tribes adopted Roman crop rotations to feed their growing villages, or when Syrian merchants kept using legionary road maps long after the eagles had flown, they weren't just copying techniques, they were perpetuating a mindset. The empire's greatest export wasn't wine or amphorae, but the idea that order could flourish anywhere, even at the world's ragged edge. A medieval wine-grower pruning his vines in the Moselle Valley might never know his terraces followed contours first laid out by a long-dead centurion overseeing army vineyards. A Balkan blacksmith's forge could stand on the exact spot where his ancestors shod Roman cavalry mounts, the heat of his fire echoing those ancient rhythms. Perhaps the most unexpected inheritance lies in language. The Latin spoken in frontier garrisons laced with Germanic slang, Greek medical terms, and Celtic place names evolved into the Romance languages. That legionary shouting at a British auxiliar to guard the gate, custodite portum, might not recognize the Spanish custodia la puerta, but the chain of meaning remains unbroken. Even military jargon seeped into everyday speech. The Spanish castle jail comes from casa, the camp's detention hut, while French soldat descends from the solidus coins paid to frontier troops. The final testament to these camps' endurance isn't in grand monuments, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary things. The way a Portuguese fisherman still mends his nets with knots documented in a 1st century quartermaster's log. How a Swiss cheesemaker ages his wheels in cellars built to Roman specifications. Even the rhythm of a Moroccan water wheel, turning as it did when legionaries first planted olives in North Africa. The frontier didn't just mark where Rome ended, it shaped where the modern world began. One repurposed stone, one borrowed word, one stubborn act of continuity at a time. The camps may have fallen, but their lessons about adaptability, resilience, and the quiet art of making a home in hostile places outlasted the empire that built them by millennia. From dawn drills to nighttime storytelling, life in Rome's frontier camps was a tapestry of hardship and humanity, threads of discipline and creativity woven together under the empire's watchful eye. These soldiers weren't just faceless warriors, they were builders laying roads that still guide modern cities, diplomats negotiating with tribes in a dozen languages, and survivors turning barren outposts into thriving communities. Every patched sandal, every letter home, every shared flask of sour wine whispered the same truth. Rome's strength wasn't just in its legions, but in the ordinary men who made the extraordinary seem routine. What lingers isn't just the grandeur of conquest, but the quiet moments that humanize these distant outposts. The Syrian archer teaching his squad to track desert winds like Bedouins. The Germanic blacksmith whose armor designs were copied by Roman smiths. Even the laughter echoing from barracks where off-duty legionaries rolled dice made from the bones of their fallen mounts. These weren't just soldiers following orders, they were adapters, blending traditions into something new, something that would outlast empires. The frontier camp was Rome's greatest paradox, a place of rigid order where cultures collided and merged, where loneliness forged unbreakable bonds, and where the empire's might was sustained not by swords alone, but by the resilience of daily life. When we walk city streets built over ancient Roman roads or trace family names back to legionary settlements, we're touching their legacy, not as conquerors frozen in marble, but as people who planted seeds of civilization in the unlikeliest soil. If this journey into their world resonated with you, consider joining our community of history enthusiasts. Hit like and subscribe to uncover more stories that bring the past to life. And tell us in the comments which fragment of legionary life stuck with you. Was it the medical ingenuity that saved lives millennia before modern antibiotics, the unexpected humor scratched onto pottery shards, or the quiet courage of families who turned frontier posts into homes? Your perspective adds another voice to this ongoing conversation across the centuries. After all, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the human threads that connect us all, from a Roman sentry's watchfire to the glow of